there's something that I know you were working on. There was a story that you were working on, and it is about a player who is no longer here, but is still a player in this league. And I don't want to disrupt the flow or the potential views that your story will get, but I'm sure you'll dive more into it.
Yeah, I was actually hoping to have this story published before we recorded today. As it turns out, it's going to be out just after lunch. So you guys will hear it first here on Snow the Goalie, and then you'll be able to read it later on Pattison. I have a story that I put together that just kind of diving into the Flyers leading up to the trade deadline, like what's next, talking about guys like Lawton and Ristolainen and, looking ahead at the assets that the Flyers have and what they might be looking for in return, et cetera, et cetera. And, we talked about 2 games ago, we had Adam Kimmelman on, and we talked a little bit about the Flyers scouting Fraser Minton from the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he talked about him a little bit because the Leafs, we've known for a while now, been interested in Scott Lawton, but they don't have a first-round pick. Danny would like to get more than a second-rounder for Lawton, so this is kind of where that conversation started from. As you know, I've been talking to a lot of people within the organization to see where things are at, and one of the things that I've been able to glean is that before the trade with Calgary, the Flyers were talking to Anaheim. They've been talking to Anaheim for a while. They've been keeping tabs on the whole availability of Trevor Zegras. I would say Danny probably first reached out to Pat Verbeek about that player leading up to last year's trade deadline. The asking price at that time was just ridiculous. It was, there's a reason he wasn't traded. The asking price was off the charts. I know Danny checked back in with him again in June, right before the draft, to see if there was something that would make sense. The asking price was still way too high at that point. Before the trade with Calgary, checked back again, and they started talking about Joel Farabee. The Ducks were interested in Farabee. They had interest in Farabee. There would have had to been more, I think, to the trade, and whether or not they ever would have gotten it across the finish line, I don't know. Ultimately, the Ducks backed out of the trade because they weren't necessarily comfortable with taking the full Farabee salary. They would have preferred that the Flyers eat a little bit of it in the trade, but Danny was not willing to do that because he's like, well, listen, Zegras hasn't looked good for 2 years, and all of a sudden we're going to eat salary and not know, we're going to take on his salary, which is $6 billion a year, right? Like, no, I'm not doing that. So that didn't end up happening. Anaheim probably wanted a first-round pick that Danny was not willing to give up for a guy like Zegras, again, who for 2 seasons now, he's had some injuries. He had a broken ankle last year, and then he had a knee injury this year, so he's missed some time. But his production has dropped off after his first 2 years in the league, and even in his second year when he had his highest point total of 68 points, his two-way game was just not there. Right. Not a good defensive player, right? So you look at that situation, if you're the Flyers, and say, do we want to really give up all these assets for a guy who maybe is not, at the top of his game or hasn't been for a while? And somebody that I had talked to in the organization said, look, guys have a bad year. Guys have a bad year and a half. He says, Zegras is kind of going into a third bad year here. Like, how do you weigh the risk versus the value, right? There. And so it ended up not happening. I don't think that there's anything left there. I think that any kind of deal would potentially be dead unless Anaheim really, really dropped the value of Zegras, because I don't see Briere giving up a first-round pick for him, or another player on the roster. There was also some thought that Anaheim might like Cam York, but I'm not sure that you give up Cam York for Zegras as well at this point, because then you got to replace York. Mm-hmm. You're basically filling one hole by creating another. Yeah. And I don't know if you go that path either. So Is it
bad that I'm not sold on York? Like, am I crazy? I feel like he's had some good moments this season. I felt like he had good moments last season, but I don't see top pair defenseman in Cam York, and I'm not exactly sure that I see the rock of even a second pair. I think he can be like the second guy on the second. I don't see it right now.
It's an interesting thing with York because York is an analytics darling. If you look at his analytic numbers, Bundy,
they're great.
Jumps off the page, like some of the best in the league.
Right.
Like you look at it and go, like if I didn't put the name on it and said, look at these numbers, you would go, that's a pretty good defenseman right there. That's a really good defenseman. But then when you watch him play, the eye test changes things because you sit there and go, I just wish there was more to him.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're as a defenseman, former defenseman, you see it maybe better than any of us do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Like, what is there another level to his game? And we haven't seen it. Like, he's good. He had a much better year last year than he has this year. I don't want to take anything away from him, but again, I don't know his relationship necessarily with Torts and how that goes. But he's a guy I think that they think, and other teams watching him probably feel like there's another gear there that we haven't seen yet. And I think that's kind of the hesitancy. But I don't pay a lot of attention in the analytics department. I'm an eye test guy when I watch him. And some nights he's been very good. And other nights it's not as good.
Right.
But, I mean, that's also part of growing as a young defenseman and trying to figure out your groove and find that groove.
Yeah. But so the overall point of this conversation, that you talk about this whole trying to work out a deal for Zegras with Farabee. It's obvious that Danny is looking for centers.
Right.
And he's even probably willing to take on somebody that you look at as a change of scenery candidate kind of player. Say, hey, listen, we know that there's talent there, and it's obviously the ceiling for Zegras is a lot higher than Joel Farabee probably was, right? But if you don't, you have to decide how much you're willing to gamble on that. Because if it doesn't work, now you've just saddled yourself with another bad contract, which you don't want to do in this.
Although it's not that bad. I mean, the Zegras deal is 5.75 this year and next year, and then he hits RFA.
Right. But
so then the question, I guess, at that point becomes: do you gamble? So if it is this year, like say there is a trade to be made there, which based on what you're saying, doesn't sound like there is. Just say conceptually they go out and they make a deal for him this year. All right, so you get to watch probably 20 or so games, maybe a little bit less, with this team, with Tortorella. God knows what happens next year. We assume Torts is probably the coach again next year. Does it work? He gets another year in that system. Does Torts get something out of him? I mean, it seems like the odd couple. It certainly seems like a relationship that on paper should not work, but Torts has managed to pull great out of guys that you wouldn't expect him to do that with. You get yourself 20 games plus another season, and then you make a decision when he hits RFA, if he's worth it or not. And maybe there's another team out there at that point who says, you know what, we'll take the gamble. Like, he didn't work with the Flyers. I don't know. I guess it really does depend on what the price is. If it's Cam York, York's about to hit RFA now. I mean, at the end of the season. He makes $1.6 million currently. They're going to re-sign him. It's just a matter of, like, are you going to overpay?
I don't think you're going to overpay, but you're probably going to pay in the neighborhood of 4.5.
Yeah,
well, I'm saying it's probably, I don't know, does he get a bridge deal before he gets his bigger one?
I don't even know what a bridge deal is anymore.
Like, but I'm saying like a shorter,
with the cap
contract.
going up, it wouldn't actually surprise me if you're the player if you do consider a bridge deal because of the cap going up.
Yeah, but I'm saying, if you're York's agent, are you sitting there going, we'll take 2 years at $9 million, and then knowing 2 years from now what that cap situation is going to be, you'll probably can then sign that 6-year
for like a 6.5 AAV
or
higher.
They're asking the player to really they'll put a lot into the next 2 years, because if they're giving him a bridge deal, they don't feel like he's the guy that give a long-term deal yet.
Yeah.
So if your agent tells you, you know what, take a bridge deal, but go play your ass off, I think that everything like that would be just fine.
I just think it's a tricky, like, this is one of those player calls that I don't envy being in Danny Briere's position.
Yeah.
Because if you get it right and you do sign him to a 5-6 year deal or whatever at, say, 4.75, $5 million cap hit. Well, if he ends up blossoming into being a guy who maybe could touch a top pair, that's a great deal, especially with the cap going up. But I think that the likelihood there is significantly higher that he is a second pair defenseman in like a best case scenario. And then you start to wonder down the line, was he another player that you needed to extend at that money? Like, certainly they should not encourage having like a no movement clause here, right? Like, it's give him the money, give him the years if you feel like it's going to be a worthwhile investment. But like, they're clearing all this money. They've done a good job of it. I don't necessarily want to see them then go and give money to a player that's unproven. And I would say that to this point, he is unproven. You really don't know what he is. And there's a higher likelihood, I think, that it ends up looking maybe like an overpay to try to retain a player. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a tough call on York. I think that...
I don't think he's a bad player. Like, to be clear, I don't think he's a bad player.
And I think that they would consider a trading York
at the deadline.
No,
or like
hold.
Okay.
If they got the value that they feel in return, like if you're getting a known entity, and Cam York has to be the piece that gets you that top line center, for example, that you've been craving for and everybody's craving for.
Sure.
And it's that guy. You're not taking a chance like you would with Zegras, but you're getting a guy that comes in and, oh yeah, this guy's going to be our number one center. We're happy with that. I think then that's part of an outside the box hockey trade that you say, okay, yeah, we have to fill that hole now, but I'd rather fill that hole than have to keep chasing for a top line center. Whereas if it's not that, you hold on to York because he's still young and he's still developing and you still think there could be more there. So I think that that's ultimately probably how you make that call. I do think a bridge deal is more likely. Danny's done that in the past, or he's tried to do that in the past. I know he was involved with the Morgan Frost deal that was 2 years, right? So you looked at a guy like Morgan Frost and you said, okay, we like the guy, but we're not yet ready to commit to him long term. Let's do that shorter term deal and see where he's at how he develops over the next 2 years. And then they traded him. So they were right to kind of pause and not give him a longer term deal like they did to Farabee before that. I think that Cam York probably fits. It's probably a better fit for the Flyers to have him on that bridge deal rather than give him that 5-6 year contract.